Hello, everyone. Today, I wanted to do a quick reading update, but also a follow-up to the previous video I did on Tolstoy and War and Peace. So I'll get to the reading update shortly here, but I did want to talk about a famous essay that was written about War and Peace, and I have a library copy right here. This is the Hedgehog and the Fox by Isaiah Berlin, an essay on Tolstoy's view of history. So I found this very useful after reading War and Peace. It does bring some of Tolstoy's historical commentary in the book. It provides some historical context and a little more insight, and actually a lot more insight into what Tolstoy was trying to do with the novel. So Isaiah Berlin himself was a important intellectual of the 20th century. I've not read a lot of Isaiah Berlin. He was primarily an essayist. He wrote a few books, but he was also very famous as a lecturer, and his lectures on the intellectual currents of the 19th and 20th centuries. And his lecture on Tolstoy is still in print and still read a lot. So, first of all, the title, The Hedgehog and the Fox, which is one way to think about how people think about the world, and I guess how intellectuals think about the world, but different worldviews. And the hedgehog view of things is that you have very one particular way or system of looking at things, and that's how you view the entire world. Okay, so if you are have a specific philosophical position or very specific views on religion or spirituality, and you kind of view everything through that lens, you're more of a hedgehog. And if you're on the other side of it, you're a fox. You're someone who is curious about a great many things. Different belief systems, different ideologies. You like to investigate and read about many different points of view and perspectives. And out of that, by through your readings and your own responses to those readings, you develop your own worldview that's a composite of all the readings that you've done. You haven't really set upon one specific way of looking at things, but you know a little bit about different different perspectives and things like that. So it's an interesting way to think about different intellectuals throughout the past, and this can apply to writers and all sorts of different people. So like you can have like he points out someone like Dante would be a hedgehog, or Dostoevsky as well would be someone who kind of has a specific way of looking at things. Okay, um, so he does a list of historical figures and different ones and how they view things. Okay, Plato would be considered more of a hedgehog, whereas Aristotle more of a fox as far as looking at the world. So that's a fascinating concept, and that's just for that alone, it's an interesting essay or lecture, I should say. Now, how it applies to War and Peace and Tolstoy and Berlin really views Tolstoy as a fox who wanted to be a hedgehog, okay, where Tolstoy absorbed and read so many different ideas and thinkers, philosophers, historians, and he was very well read and was familiar with many different ways of looking at the world, okay, but ultimately he found that somewhat unsatisfying, where he was hoping someday to maybe come to a very specific way of looking at the world, or even like you could have rules to it, specifically when thinking about history, right? Where, and if you read War and Peace, you quickly get this, where Tolstoy is very critical of his historians, the historical profession, the way historians come to conclusions about things, and like even like a battle, okay, and historians will develop theories of why this side or that side won or lost the battle, and come up with some silly, in Tolstoy's view, some rather silly conclusions. Like the one in the novel he points to is at the Battle of Borodino, a big set piece in the book, where a lot of historians at the time argued that Napoleon had a cold, okay, and that accounted for his poor performance or poor judgment at the battle. And Tolstoy finds that ridiculous nonsense, okay, and and the fact that you can never really have laws of history of why, or historical systems of why people do what they do, or why even nations rise and fall and things like that. Tolstoy finds all that to be just pointless intellectual exercise. Okay, just almost like kind of assuaging one's ego and making one feel intelligent, and maybe like I've anyone who's been like with you experience this, like kind of go with like military history, and there's all sorts of armchair military historians or professional historians who will, you know, talk about why a battle was won or lost and be very authoritative. Well, this and this happened, and that's why it happened, and just have a very strong um, conclusion that they've just decided that's the truth and that's that. And even among, even like among booktube, I see that sometimes where people develop very strong opinions about certain writers, certain novels, and will declare like that's the law, like they discovered the laws of literature, and or their opinions are the laws of literature. So, and that can be off-putting, and I get the sense that Tolstoy found coming to very strong conclusions like that serve no purpose whatsoever except the ego, right? So that's one thing Berlin talk writes about in the essay is Tolstoy was really searching for different ways to understand why things happened the way they did. And one part of it, and one thing Tolstoy, his big insight was that while historians, he's 19th century when his historical field was starting to become professionalized, that historians write about politicians and generals, things like that, or they write chronicles of political events. And Tolstoy would say, well, that doesn't really tell us anything at all. I mean, it just you're just kind of giving us a narrative of this government rose, this one fell, or this politician rose. Just a very kind of almost repetitive narrative of how things happened, what happened, and Tolstoy really believed that it's the inner life of people that's the real story of history. What goes on in someone's mind? What drives them to do what they do? So Tolstoy, that's one thing historians simply at his time just are completely oblivious to. And there was one quote in the lecture, if I can find it, spoke to that. History, as it is normally written, usually represents political, public events as the most important, while spiritual, inner events are largely forgotten. It's the inner events that are the most real, the most immediate experience of human beings. and only they are what life, in the last analysis, is made of. Hence, the routine political historians are just talking shallow nonsense. That's Berlin's quote from the lecture. And and I think, and if you read War and Peace, that's what it's all about, where Tolstoy is trying to get in, really get close to his characters and getting into the minutia of their daily lives and how they view events and why they react to events a certain way. And of course, a lot of what Tolstoy was writing before psychology became a human field, and certainly the contributions of psychologists has had an influence on history and things like that. But ultimately, Tolstoy felt that, and that's really what Berlin gets to in the essay, is that it's chaotic. It really is chaotic, that you can never really come to any strong conclusion about why things happen the way they are, what motivates people to do what they do, why they choose to act, why people don't choose to act. And ultimately, Tolstoy just kind of threw up his hands and said that and the battle, like a massive military battle, is the perfect metaphor for that, because it's so chaotic, it's impossible to figure out why it turned out the way it did, because you have so many things at play, right? That's interesting, and that's interesting, and that's one thing, a big takeaway from reading War and Peace, that Tolstoy is saying that we can come up with easy explanations of why this happened or that happened, and so that's fascinating. And Berlin was really insightful. The essay also goes a lot into the intellectual currents of the 19th century that Tolstoy was also involved with, and various philosophers, and there's one particular theologian who also influenced Tolstoy's view of things, right? And the 19th century was all about trying to find laws of human behavior, and really trying to use a scientific approach to understanding why people do what they do. And Tolstoy was very skeptical of that, but he was, like I said, he was very skeptical of many different attempts to systematically describe human behavior. So a lot of ideas in the essay. Where Tolstoy landed, where it's a dense essay at times, and where Tolstoy landed on this, towards the end of his life, he became had a religious awakening, and that's kind of where it all led to for him, and finding kind of just what I took from the essay. Tolstoy found comfort in just observing people live their lives, and the everyday minutia of life, and that's where he took some solace. But anyway, back to the top of this essay. Like I said, it's worth multiple reads, and it does shed a lot of light onto the novel War and Peace. It does. Like, I studied, was a history major in college, and this was not assigned, and this would have been interesting to read in a history class, but clearly the field has evolved a lot since the 19th century. But still, it does make you draw pause anytime you hear anyone start making declarations about anything in history and why it happened the way it did. It's like I said, with the Tolstoy view, it's very chaotic, and it's very difficult to come to any strong conclusions of things like that. And of course, modernism, 20th century literature really would go more internal and trying to understand, I think, trying to understand why, going inside the mind of people. And I've talked about Joyce on the last video with specifically with Ulysses, and when he is really going inside the mind of characters. And I believe there's also the Faulkner quote about the literature should be all about the conflicts of the human heart. So that almost seems to be directly going off what Tolstoy was trying to go for in his literature as well. So that's all I'll say about it. I just want to talk about this a little bit as just kind of a little follow up to the War and Peace video. Just right now, do a quick reading update. So let's see. So I've been continuing with the Stephen King books I've been reading. Right now, I'm in the middle of the Tommy Knockers, this big chunker King wrote in published in the late 1980s, and I'm about a fourth of the way through it. It's a weird one for King. I know this book was written when he was going through some personal. He's written about this. He was going through some personal stuff when he wrote this. So, and that kind of shows if you read the book, where it's basically the book's about a woman and discovers a buried spaceship near her home. And the story kind of goes from there. And it's like I said, it's a strange one for King, but I'm not going to say it's like a good book, but nevertheless, I am kind of enjoying the Tommy Knockers, and it's because it's just there's so many as King tends to do. There's so many diversions and in his book, like there's just 30, 40 pages of just people talking about nuclear power and the things like that. So I'm kind of amused with the Tommy Knockers, and we'll come back with that. Also started reading this book called The Outsider with by Colin Wilson, and I'd read this book before, and I remember not liking it too much, but I for whatever reason I decided to give the book another chance. And Colin Wilson was known as a sci-fi writer. He was a very prolific writer who wrote a lot, wrote about many things, and he was a young man when he wrote this book. He was 24, 25 years old when this book was published. But the book is all about what it means to be alienated in society, how, and he looks at the lives of writers he admires and things like that, and what it, you know, what alienation does to someone, especially someone with art and artistic ambitions, and what that all means. So, there is kind of like a master's thesis tone at times, but at the same time, yeah, I don't know, it's kind of engaging me a little bit, and I might continue with looking at the Outsider, Wilson. And then finally, I've had this around a long time. This is just today. I was looking at Howl. This is the short pocketbook series of Ginsberg, and I was reading Howl earlier tonight, and America, his poem America is in here, which it feels like the right time right now to go. I used to read Ginsberg a lot, but it's kind of it feels right now, especially reading his poetry in this time in America, this post-election moment that we're in, and it's for me, I found it almost kind of comforting to go back to Ginsberg and read about his his beat prose about America. So like I said, I haven't read Ginsberg in a long time, and like I said, I like it. I'm a big fan of Ginsberg and that whole beat era of literature. So anyway, just a quick reading update, and thanks for watching, and have a good day.